Good afternoon. Hello, my name is Ann Connor. I'm with Harris Space and Intelligence Systems, and we are thrilled today to sponsor the NASA Chiefs panel, and I'll be introducing the discussion today. Okay, so we have joined the NASA anniversary celebration by commemorating our own long-standing partnership with the agency over its 60-year history, from communications and telemetry to imaging and remote sensing. Harris is ready with NASA to meet the technologies for the future space missions. Recent policy shifts and attention from Congress gives us a strong indication that NASA has a bright future ahead. Any effort worth pursuing takes ingenuity, teamwork, and recognition that each role is critical to the overall success of a mission. Success for humanity's next big leaps will not only depend on advanced technologies, but also on strong partnerships and execution across all of the critical functions represented on today's panel. I'd like to introduce the panel to you, and then we'll kick it off to the moderator. First, as the moderator, we have Doug Terrier, who's the acting chief technologist, J.D. Polk, Chief Health and Medical Officer, Jeff DeWitt, Chief Financial Officer, and Sumera Thompson-King, Chief Legal Officer. Doug?
Welcome to the Chiefs panel. So we have like the powerhouse of NASA Chiefs here to talk to you today. And this is billed as an informal conversation. We want to make it that way. Really just to talk about a lot of what's going on with the changing policies and NASA priorities going forward and how that relates to space commerce specifically, which is why we're all here for this SpaceCom 2018. So I'm really excited to have my fellow Chiefs here. And before we get started, I'm gonna ask Jeff, Jeff DeWitt was actually present in person at the Mars Insight landing yesterday, and I'm gonna ask Jeff just give us a recap of that because I think that was pretty exciting time for all of us.
There we go. So I'll tell you, it's I'm really glad having that being yesterday that it went very well. And it was perfect landing and very successful. And we weren't talking about something else because those things are very, very hard to do, as we all know. And so I'm so proud of NASA and the team. And we have so many smart people running around that do that stuff. I could never do the engineering, I do the money. But what a great thing to be a part of and to be right there for. So just an exciting time. And I'm so glad it went off successfully. $830 million is there now to take... We're taking the heartbeat of Mars and learning about the core and a lot of things we don't know. So all this leads to the data that we're going to need to put humans there and just filling in more empty holes of what we need for that. But what a wonderful thing. It was exciting. I'll tell you what, you could feel the air, and people were crying and hugging, as you saw on TV. And you don't get much better press for NASA than a successful landing on another planet like that. But yeah, that was exciting. And again, very, very happy that went over well. It was a perfect landing. And I think that's going to be something that helps us even on the Hill to go back and show that we're doing good things. So what a great day. It was a great day yesterday.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Hey, while you have the mic, why don't you just give us a 2-minute, your role as a CFO, what your office does for NASA?
So we obviously handle all the money. The $20.7 billion for NASA goes through my office. Right now we're working on the 2020 budget, and we're expecting pass back any day from OMB. Actually, it was supposed to be today. It got pushed till tomorrow. And so, which is nice because I thought it might happen while I was sitting here. And we go into kind of a frenzy for the next week of dealing with the 2020 budget. But we handle all the money going out, and a big focus of NASA and of the administration is to involve more commercial partners and stretch taxpayer dollars as far as we can. And so we're looking as a big focus of what we do to involve as many commercial partners and commercial money and really expand the mission of NASA. And a lot of that starts with the money. So we don't get much press, but I know everybody in my office is very, very mission oriented as well in terms of how can we stretch these dollars and do as much good work and exploration as we can with the dollars we have. So, but we handle the budget for NASA, and any typical year, we're actually dealing with about 4 different budget budget years, and so when we talk about money, a lot of times in my office, I say, okay, what year are we dealing with this bucket of money? And as you know, with NASA, there's a lot of buckets of money that we put it in. So a lot of what we do is just figure out which buckets to go in. But we handle the money at my office. There you go.
Samura, so a lot of people may not know just how deeply involved your office is with every aspect of our mission operations. So tell us a little more.
Good afternoon, everyone. So most folks don't realize that there are legal offices at each of the 9 NASA centers. Also at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, we have a NASA management office with legal counsel there, and our NASA Shared Services Center also has legal counsel. And the last office is our largest office, which is our headquarters operation, where I have a staff of approximately 30 attorneys. The areas that we practice in are very broad in the agency. We have people, so we have personnel issues that our general law group covers. 85% of the budget that Jeff manages goes out in government contracts, so we have a very robust government contracts and acquisition integrity, otherwise known as fraud program. And we also have a number of international partners, so the folks here in Houston who work on ISS are very, very familiar with our activities there, and we have a legal organization that addresses issues in our agreements with partner countries for ISS and other international partnerships that we have around the world. And then our last office is our commercial and intellectual property group, because there are a lot of innovations going on in the agency, and it's our responsibility under the Space Act to share and disseminate that technology with others. So those are the big areas of legal practice that we work in for the agency.
JD, so obviously your expertise is keeping humans functioning and working in space. Tell us a little bit more about what some of the big challenges are that you see from NASA's perspective for long-duration spaceflight, and then maybe you can start also go into how we're transferring some of that to enable commercial spaceflight.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. On correctly. There we go. There are a lot of things that we see on the physiology side for human spaceflight that we don't share right away. A lot of that is due to medical privacy until we have enough cases that we can talk about them in the open. We have an old saying at NASA that 1 is a case study, 2 is a series, and 3 is a prospective randomized trial. And so it takes us a while to get enough astronauts to where we can talk about some of the medical issues that we have. So a lot of the commercial spaceflight sector probably doesn't know a lot of the things that we deal with or what are the maladies that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis. So part of our job is going to be educating. And we have an MOU with the FAA right now to educate them on the space physiology and medicine and the cases that we've seen. And so educating the commercial sector on the different aspects that they'll have to be leery of and to prepare for and to protect their crews, as well as protecting our crews when they're flying our crews. But we want to make sure that they are safe and prosperous in their ventures as well. And so passing on that knowledge is probably one of our biggest things that we'll need to do coming up. And there are some big issues. There are optic nerve edema, which is swelling around the optic nerve that changes the astronaut's vision. There's mild brain swelling and brain edema. So if you can imagine getting to Mars and having some mild brain swelling as an astronaut. There will be some bone loss. We won't be able to fly the same robust suite of hardware that we're currently flying on ISS, so we'll have some bone loss and muscle loss. And so there's a few, and of course the radiation risk is probably the elephant in the room, and the potential lifetime cancer risk associated with an increased radiation risk. So quite a few things and a few challenges. I think that equates to job security for a while.
All right, thank you, JD. So in terms of the policy, big overarching policy that's kind of guiding our work right now, I think many of you are familiar with the fact that we've got the National Space Council has been re-energized under the Vice President's leadership. We've seen 3 directives come out of the Space Council so far. The first is, of course, directed at NASA to return humans to the moon for sustainable presence and development of that resource on the way to Mars. The second is really aimed at reducing the regulatory barriers to access to space. And then the third has to do with traffic management. All of that together really, I think, emphasizes the administration's real emphasis on commercialization of space and enabling that to occur with all the various policies that are underway. I wonder if we could turn it back over to Jeff, and just Jeff, with that in mind, could you give us a kind of big picture outline? What are the big ticket items coming up for NASA in the next couple of years, and what are we focused on, where we have our big budget items focused?
Well, obviously the directives from the White House, Moon and Mars, and that's obviously not going to happen in the next few years, but a lot of the budget planning and things that we're doing are leading towards that. So we'd love to get to the moon, and the plan is to get to the moon and then go back to Mars. And the administrator was asked a lot about that yesterday. If you watch any of the coverage from the InSight landing, a lot of the coverage is about what are we doing, when are we going to Mars, when are we doing these things. So a lot of the budget planning that we're doing are related to those. And again, in my office, and we have CFOs. I oversee a CFO at every center, and the CFO staff is about 2,300 people. And a lot of that's because of the procurement and everything else, and a lot of the partnerships we're doing with the commercial sector. And so I know in my office, if you go back, NASA used to be an agency where we owned and operated everything we did, and we built it ourselves. And then we transitioned to a model. We'd use contractors to build for us. And now we have contractors that own, and NASA's what we're going to see in the future is a model where instead of us owning the satellite that gets the data, we're going more and more commercial, where we're going to have providers. We just want to buy the data and have others own the satellites and operate them. And we're still going more and more and that's what you see the focus in our office is how do we keep pushing the envelope on getting more commercial partners involved in what we do and bring in more, even small business, everything else. We really want to expand the reach that NASA has in the business community and involve as many players as we can so we can do more.
Great. Samara, I wonder, if we look at those policy directives and realize that space is going to be really a lot of different departments in the government are touching space access, so it include Commerce, the FAA, so on. So there's a real need for NASA to work across government agencies. Can you talk a little bit what's already going on and how you're working to collaborate with other agencies, and specifically how we're enabling the private sector to have better access to that entire community?
So what we're doing in the legal community is working with the program officials who are looking at commercial activities, looking at ways we can address issues, and if there are problem areas, how do we address those problems? And so that requires coordination with FAA, with the broader Department of Transportation, with the Department of Commerce, with NOAA. And what we have done in the past few years is we've assembled a small working group of individuals, attorneys, and program folks from each of those agencies to address particular issues related to commercial space activities and also NASA activities, so that we have a coordinated approach and that we all talk with each other as we look at issues which might have to be addressed through legislation or other regulatory changes. And as Jeff mentioned, or I think it was probably Douglas, on SPD 2, as we talk about what those regulatory issues are, there is in that guide, in the presidential memo, a plan for the Department of Commerce to lead a legislative proposal effort where it specifically identifies DOT, Commerce, and NASA to work together to develop a proposal so that there will be in the Department of Commerce a group that's going to coordinate commercial space activities. So the effort that our working group has been engaged in for the past few years will continue and support that effort.
Great, thank you, Samara. JD, so we get asked a lot about what NASA's role is going to be in as we see more privatized human spaceflight efforts popping up, what our role is in that, whether there's some regulatory or oversight role, which I think the answer is we're not in that business. But can you talk about how we're working with FAA and others and ensuring that our knowledge base is transferred and how that's going to happen?
Yeah, thanks. We have vastly different charters if you look at ourselves and the FAA. The FAA is a regulatory agency. The FAA is actually concerned about the safety of the public. Their regulations that they put forward toward pilots isn't because they are concerned about the well-being and preventive medicine of pilots necessarily. It's because they want the pilots to fly a safe aircraft to protect the public. whereas our role is slightly different. We're highly concerned with our astronauts and making sure that they have a very long and healthy life, and we also want to make sure that we have mission success, so we don't want any medical issue to jeopardize a mission. The public really doesn't enter into that equation. So ours is not a regulatory agency. A regulatory agency is concerned about the general welfare of the public. And so we won't be getting into that particular role, but how do we transition, and this is something that Kirk Shireman and I have had discussions about, is how do we transition from where we are right now, which NASA has very firm regulations and standards for our astronauts to prevent certain risks on the ISS and certain medical things from happening, to where the commercial sector is right now, which is, hey, can you just give us what we need to know and the standards that we need to have, and not be overly burdensome, and from a regulatory standpoint. And so we're trying to work with the FAA on how do they strike that balance right now. The FAA is going to be certifying the commercial spaceflight pilots to a flying Class 2 physical right now. And there's no talk currently about passengers meeting a certain medical requirement, but when you talk about on the NASA side, if we have a passenger coming up, since it's an enclosed environment, obviously we worry about things like communicable disease and things that might be passed on. So we try to transition. How do we transition our regulations over to then what the FAA is going to need? And a lot of that's been a lot of dialogue between us and the FAA to understand how each other comes at this process from a different fidelity and fiduciary standpoint.
So while you have the mic, JD, we're talking about some future state of commercial spaceflight, but in fact we have 2 commercial crew flights that are potentially going to test flights occurring next year. Can you tell us about how we're positioned for that relative to medical risks and so on, and what the challenges are there, and how you feel we're doing in overcoming those?
Yeah, it's a lot of it, I think, is we have a robust infrastructure. Kathy Kerner and her folks at Human Health and Performance at JSC have a huge infrastructure. We'd like it to be larger from a tech authority side, but it's a large infrastructure for medical, whereas on the commercial side, there may be a person or 2 people. And so instead of just speaking in medicalese, we're having to educate their engineers as well on our medical requirements, and to change our lexicon and our lexicon for our standards so that the engineering population can understand it, not just the medical population. And so those are some of the things that we're working on. They're making really good progress. We're excited with where we're going. As with any spacecraft, there are always things that are puts and takes and arguing back and forth on whether or not something can be waived or not. And again, I think it was von Braun who said that it won't be the engineering problems that decide human spaceflight. It'll actually be the human form. And whether the human tolerance in space and exploration, and I think that is true, and we're working diligently to educate them on those things. And we're seeing a good relationship on back and forth as this relationship matures between us and the commercial sector.
Great, thank you, JD. Before I leave that topic, Samara, your team is really concerned with not just the medical, but all of our technology transfer and how we're enabling as much as possible for the commercial sector to have access to this. Can you say a little bit about what we've done already and are doing to make that more available to the commercial teams?
So one of the things that I like to remind folks of is since this agency began, since legislation was created that established NASA in 1958, we have had very specific language directing us to do 2 things. One, to disseminate information to the widest possible group that we can. And part of that dissemination includes sharing the technology that we develop with the commercial industry and with the public, because we don't use our taxpayer resources for this space program just for the space program, but to benefit citizens, benefit humanity, and foster and facilitate commercial activities. So part of that is our patent program that we have in the agency. And very specifically in the Space Act, there is information and direction to the NASA administrator in how to use the technology that's developed that we pay for through these government contracts that we award. And the government owns that information. The statute is very clear about that. But there's also a waiver process, and what our office is very much engaged in with the various scientists and engineers who are working across the agency is to make sure that they prepare technology reports, have the appropriate documentation, so that then at some point, if the company who might be working on that requests a waiver so that they can have a license to commercialize those products, they do. And we have a very robust spinoff program. So if you look up spinoff.nasa.gov, you will see the technology that we've transferred, how businesses are using that, and we want to continue that and have a more robust program that's been happening under Doug's leadership within the agency, and we are going to see more of that. Our patent attorneys across the agency are more busy than they have been in many years because we are doing a lot of new technology work across the agency, and our scientists and engineers are very busy.
So Jeff, we actually have, I think, in my career at NASA, probably the biggest amount of activity that we've had for a long time. We've got the International Space Station, we've got SLS Orion, Gateway, they're working, the CLIPS program. We've got big ticket items on the science side, James Webb coming up, and then the Aero demo programs. A lot of activity going on all across the agency. How do you think talk about our general budget outlook? We've really enjoyed some pretty good years in the last couple of years. Tell us what the outlook looks like, particularly with the recent election results and changes in committee. How do you think that'll affect our outlook?
You know, and I'll tell you, that's something we've talked about a lot just very recently. As you know, we've lost some of our biggest champions on the Hill who've been around for decades. Without naming names, one of them here, Culbertson. We've lost in the last election, and there's with our support in the Hill, the great thing is there's no politics inside NASA, and it's we have strong bipartisan support, but you have some people up there that have a much stronger interest in NASA and what we do and really fight for us, and we need to almost cultivate a few more leaders now on the Hill for that, because some of the leaders, like you said, lost the most recent election. So there's a little bit of nervousness right now in terms of who's going to pick up that torch on the Hill for us and help. A lot of my job involves dealing with some of the appropriators and that on the Hill and working with the budgets. So, and there's a dual-edged sword, because sometimes on the Hill, without naming which ones, they'll say, well, no, we don't want you to do satellite A. We're going to give you money for satellite B, and that could be something we don't want to do. So sometimes the Hill tells us what to do with the money, and we have to go a certain way and build a certain satellite because, one of the lawmakers really wants that thing done. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. The recent elections really are somewhat of a game changer for how life has been at NASA, and to see who gets the committee relationships and who's going to pick up the torch for NASA and that kind of a thing. I think that's, if you saw some of the people that lost the most recent elections and how strong they were with NASA, that's going to be something we're going to be figuring out in the next few months, and it's certainly been a hot topic of conversation at headquarters in terms of what we do with that. But outside of that, we're still focused on getting all the projects we have off the ground. We from James Webb to SLS to everything else. We saw how fun it is yesterday when we get something that works successfully and we land, and if we can keep those things rolling and get to commercial crew, for me, I push very hard to. We want to do things as quickly as we can, but we also have to do things as safely as we can. So that's the one thing the public never realizes when we push back timeframes on projects. We want to make sure with all this money and time invested that it goes well, and some of these things have brand new technologies, never been done before. And yesterday when I was at JPL, the next thing there that they're still working on, you can see it in the process, is Mars 2020 and in the rover there. And so And again, on Mars 2020, from the coring of the rocks and the different things we're going to do, there are things they're developing that have never been done before. And so, but that's a project, some things get pushed back. One thing I keep telling them is, you guys put 2020 in the name, you better launch it in 2020. So we'll see if they hit that. We'll see if that's a good strategy or not. If that works, we're going to start putting years in all the names, I think.
It's great. And I'll just say, one of the things that I certainly have, being a technology person, right? So very aware of what our technology and our engineering folks do, very aware of what JD and the medical teams do. I think it's really important for everybody to be aware of what folks like the CFO, Samara's office do, because in many ways, the legislative and the finance committees and so on, that world is more complicated and more challenging, and the requirements are constantly changing, which makes the work they do very, very difficult. And we're very lucky to have such a strong team in place and building those relationships. I think the good news, as Jeff said, is that we've enjoyed bipartisan support, and we see changes on the margin, but we managed to keep moving forward with the core programs that we have. Jeff, if I could go to you one more time on. One thing that I know you've been a big advocate for is affordability in our programs, and really challenging some of our big cost programs. Can you tell me more about what you are doing, what you see that your office can do to help us, keep control of costs, which is one of our biggest challenges on some of these really difficult programs going forward, and even how some of the emerging commercial capabilities can help us with leveraging those for affordability.
It's really tough. And when I come in fresh and with a fresh set of eyes, and there seems to have been a culture in the past at NASA where sometimes they just want to get the program approved at all costs, and they'll say whatever, it's going to cost X. And it seems at times they know it's going to cost X plus, but they'll say X to get it approved because they figure if they say X plus, it might not get approved. So one of my big initiatives too is that we want to be a lot more transparent and accurate in the initial cost estimating of these programs, and if they don't get approved, they don't get approved, because one of the problems we have if we overrun in one part of the budget is, even if Congress says yes, keep going and get the thing done, they don't give us extra money to do that. We have to find that in our budget, and it takes from other parts of the budget to get it done. So that's the problem we have if like James Webb or anything else is now we're sacrificing in other parts of the budget in order to keep going when we thought something was going to be done in a certain year, and it goes on an extra 2 or 3 years. So one of my big initiatives inside NASA is to really try to get these to get accuracy in our forecasting, so we can better budget for these things too, because these projects, James Webb and SLS, when they overrun, these blow up the budget to a certain degree, where we're really trying to really find how we're going to fill these holes. And so, when you really go back, I think that the main thing that we have to do at NASA is in the initial cost estimating, and be as accurate as we can, transparent as we can in the initial stages, because once it gets far enough down the road, there's only so much you can do. You just have to keep going until you get it finished. But we would love to see, and in our commercial partners too, a lot of these things we're talking about, the problems can be at the commercial partners, not within NASA. But we really want to focus on getting projects done safely, successfully, but being accurate in the number, and using taxpayer dollars very wisely. Because one thing we always have to remember is the money we're using. This is hard-earned taxpayer money. And in essence, it can be considered kind of a luxury for the country in terms of, this is what we do, is to go out and to explore and to inspire, but to maintain that bipartisan support, we have to be doing these things wisely and fiscally responsibly. So it's a big push for what I've been doing inside NASA.
Great.
Doug, it makes me a little nervous in that every time he said we have to take from somewhere else, he kept turning to me on the right. So I'm just, if you see me sliding back. Hey,
JD, while you have the mic, to give you a chance, we have a couple more minutes. Last minute thoughts from you, and specifically from your perspective, right? Thinking of NASA's programs, key programs, and more broadly about commercial spaceflight. What do you think what are the biggest challenges from your perspective as we look forward?
Well, we've always only had to keep a crew healthy for the duration of the mission. And then shuttle, that was 14 days. And so it was pretty easy to keep somebody healthy for 14 days. Then we went to 6 months, and it got a little bit more difficult to keep somebody healthy for 6 months, and we had to get a little bit more robust in our exams and the things that we would look for and surveil for. But now you're talking a 3-year mission, and there are things that we're looking at that cross ethical bounds on medical side. For example, we're going to take out somebody's appendix or gallbladder before they go. Well, ethically, would you ever ethically in medicine take out a healthy organ in somebody that's not sick? No. But the risk of somebody having that type of incident on Mars is something we need to talk about and figure out if you want your Navy fighter pilot person to take out your appendix on Mars. So, especially with a 20-minute one-way communication where we say, "Oh, don't cut there," and wait. A little longer. Wait, 20 more minutes. So there's some interesting challenges that come up, and we will bust our radiation standards as they're currently written, going to Mars. And so what are the implications for that? Of course, when those were written, and we're comparing data from the 1940s and 50s and the Hiroshima data and other things, and generally we're living longer and a little bit healthier than we were back then. So are there different benchmarks? Do those need to be adjusted? Those are things that we're all looking at.
Samura, I'll ask you the same question. From your perspective, just very generally, top level, what do you think are the biggest, or maybe one of the biggest challenges for the agency going forward?
Actually, I don't know what the biggest challenge is, but we commercial space and commercial spaceflight activities are going to present challenges and raise new issues that we are just going to have to be prepared and be ready to answer. We're anticipating what some of those issues are. Other things are going to come up, but the thing that we have to be nimble about, and I have to say our legal community is very nimble about addressing those issues. And I'll start with the commercial orbital transportation services activity that we engaged in back in 2006. For folks who, and I'm referring a little bit to what Jeff mentioned early on, we at NASA have contractors who have developed our spaceflight vehicles, but they have been owned by the government because we're paying for them. They've been operated and managed by us. What we wanted to do as part of our authority under our legislation is to promote commercial activities, and we did that with the COTS award by trying to facilitate the development of commercial capability. And we did that. That's how SpaceX was awarded a funded Space Act agreement, and Orbital also has that agreement to develop that capability. Once they developed that capability, NASA then took the approach that we would obtain services from them. We weren't going to manage those flights. We were going to go to those two companies and ask them to provide that service. We are looking to do more of that. Going to the private sector, as Jeff mentioned, to get that commercial service, to have those capabilities. So in low Earth orbit, to have a commercial capability there on the International Space Station. That then frees up our budget to do exploration around the moon and onto Mars. So I think it's a very exciting time in the agency. There are a lot of commercial activities and there's a lot of commercial interest out there, and there are issues that we're just going to have to be nimble and address as they arise.
Very good. Jeff, I guess I'll give you the last word, same question. What do you think biggest challenges from your perspective? And then we'll probably have a minute or two for one or two questions.
Well, from my perspective, the biggest challenge is for a $20 billion a year agency, $21 billion a year agency, to the way we fund agencies, is year to year funding, and you honestly never know what the next year is going to bring, and so it makes it tough. It's a very challenging to handle the finances of an agency like this, and you'd never do this in the private sector where you're funding everything year to year, and the back and forth that goes on from the Hill and OMB and all the different stakeholders that we have, and everyone, all the different people and inputs that come into this. And including how you're going to spend the money, what you're going to spend it on, and so it's really a fascinating thing. I was in state government before. My job before this was the state treasurer of Arizona, and to see it from the state perspective and now the federal perspective, government does do things with money you'd never do in the private sector. I can't say that's a good thing, and so we try to run it as smoothly as we can, but the biggest challenge is, like I said, now knowing that it's year-to-year funding and how this is when you do lose some of your champions on the Hill, and to see what the future is going to bring. I mean, and I'm sure we'll find new champions and everything like this, but the recent elections throw some things in doubt, and there's going to be a state of flux in terms of the relationships we have in the Hill and what comes the next budget cycle, and these are tough waters to navigate, but that's what, thankfully we have people around too that have been doing this for so long, and we really get it. So, but from my perspective, the budget challenges year to year are much more extensive than you'd ever see publicly, and how much work goes into that.
Great, thank you. All right, I think we have time. We have time for one or two questions for the audience. Anybody want to volunteer? If there, should we? What's the prospect for radiation protection? The question is, what's the prospect for radiation protection at JD?
Well, there are several ways to look at that. One, by decreasing the trip time, that's why I'm the biggest fan of the engineers building engines. If I decrease the time from point A to point B, that's one of the best ways to decrease my exposure to the cosmic galactic radiation. That's probably first and foremost. Second, there are protective materials and material science that they're working on for shielding. And also, looking at things that allow the human body to help repair itself. That's why a lot of our genetic science and other science that we are doing is important as well. But then, we've looked at things even on the Science Technology Mission Directorate has looked at things like active radiation shielding, which is creating a magnetic field around a spacecraft. But, to Jeff's point, it's too expensive for us right now, too large, takes too much power, too much mass, and too much money. It'd probably eat up our entire budget to invent that right now. But that is something that might be ripe for the commercial sector to work on in the future as well. So those are things that we are looking on right now for radiation.
Thanks, JD. Anybody else? One in the back. You have to come up so we can hear you.
My question is about what's the prospect about space nuclear? Space nuclear applications.
Space
Okay.
nuclear.
Nuclear?
Nuclear propulsion, is that what you're asking about?
Plans?
Oh, power, nuclear power.
Doug, that's you're the
That's
chief
my-
technology officer.
So I can tell you that we've had really for decades now. There have been various studies looking at space power, nuclear power, surface power specifically. I assume is what you're asking about, and we've recently seen a lot more interest in that, particularly with the directive to go back to the surface of the moon. Obviously, we'll need for all the work that we need to do on the surface, including generating fuel and oxygen and everything else that we need to do with in situ resource utilization. That requires a lot of power. So there's a lot of very much re-energized interest in nuclear surface power, and I think you're well aware that we had from the Space Technology Mission Directorate some recent announcements about directions in restarting those programs. So I think that's not only a very viable technology, but probably a very attractive technology for really long-term exploitation of the lunar surface or really any surface activity, whether it's a surface power or in fact in space power, maybe a long-term application as well. But yeah, that's certainly an attractive option.
There's also an advantage to going to the moon in that the moon, the lunar regolith has H3 in abundance, and that can be used as raw material for that as well.
All right, I think that's about the time we have, and I want to thank our panelists and thank our sponsors. Thank you all for being part of this today.